15 names. Every one of them is beloved. Every one of them connected to accounts so disturbing that the most powerful publicity machine ever built spent decades and millions of dollars ensuring you would go your entire life without hearing them. The machine worked until now. The witnesses nobody was allowed to hear. There are stars the public loved, and then there was Errol Flynn. The man was practically a force of nature, dark, devastatingly handsome, possessed of a swaggering physical confidence that made every woman in the theater feel personally chosen. His films were events: Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Dawn Patrol. For millions of women who came of age in the 1930s and 40s, Flynn was not merely a star. He was the standard against which every other man on screen was measured. And he was Warner Brothers' greatest weapon and its most valuable asset. And the studio knew precisely what that asset was worth. Which is exactly why, in the autumn of 1942, Warner Brothers moved with a speed and a thoroughness that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with preservation. In October of that year, Flynn faced not one but two separate criminal trials involving teenage girls, Betty Hansen, 17 years of age, and Peggy Satterlee, 15. The trials were public, the courtrooms were full, the newspapers covered the proceedings, and yet what the public read bore almost no resemblance to what was actually happening inside those courtrooms. Because by the time the first witness was sworn in, the studio's legal machinery had already been operating for weeks. Flynn's attorney, Jerry Geisler, was not merely a talented lawyer. He was Hollywood's most effective legal fixer, a man who understood that in a courtroom where a beloved star's image was at stake, the most powerful strategy was not to defend the accused, but to destroy the accusers. What followed was a systematic campaign to discredit both young women so thoroughly that their characters, not Flynn's conduct, became the story the press reported. Their backgrounds were investigated. Their personal histories were placed before the jury in the most unflattering possible light. Witnesses who might have corroborated their accounts were approached before they could testify. Studio-connected journalists shaped the coverage with a consistency that bore all the hallmarks of coordination. Flynn was acquitted on both charges, and the American public, reading their newspapers the following morning, did not learn about the machinery that had produced that acquittal. They learned a new phrase: "I like Flynn." A celebration, a joke, a cultural artifact that transformed the criminal trial of a Hollywood star into a punchline that entered the language and never left it. Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterlee lived the remainder of their lives beneath that punchline. The suppressed witness accounts, the pre-trial witness contact, the full scope of what Warner Brothers had spent and done and arranged, none of it surfaced until biographers gained access to studio archives decades later. By then, Flynn had been a legend for 40 years. The machinery had worked exactly as it was designed to work. And two young women had paid the price of its efficiency: Warner Brothers. He spent a fortune on lawyers and fixers to protect Errol Flynn. The next story required no lawyers at all, because the studio found something even more effective than legal machinery. It found silence, and it enforced that silence around a passing that has never been fully explained. The passing that 20th Century Fox decided was nobody's business. Carol Landis, in 1948, was 29 years old, luminously talented, and completely in love with Rex Harrison, who was married to someone else. She was the kind of woman people remembered after meeting her once: warm, funny, generous with her attention in a way that made the person she was speaking to feel briefly like the most important person in any room. Harrison was at the height of his career, polished and patrician. You're the kind of leading man that 20th Century Fox had invested considerable resources in building. When Landis was found unresponsive in her home on the morning of July 5, 1948, the official determination arrived quickly. Barbiturate overdose ruled a self-inflicted act. The case was closed before most people had finished reading the headline. What the headline did not contain was this: Rex Harrison had dined with Carol Landis the evening before she was found. He had, by his own account, discovered her when he returned to the house the following morning. And before he contacted emergency services, Rex Harrison placed a call to his personal attorney. The inquest that followed was, by the standards of any serious investigation, remarkable. Remarkable for what it did not pursue. The timeline of Harrison's movements that evening was not rigorously examined. The contents of communications between Harrison and Landis in the days preceding her passing, communications that those connected to their production later described as deeply distressed in tone, connected directly to pressure she was receiving about the future of the relationship, were never entered into the public record. Fox's legal representatives were present and active throughout proceedings that lasted a fraction of the time such an inquiry would ordinarily warrant. Those proceedings concluded, and then, as if on a signal that required no actual signal, the story stopped being pursued. Harrison departed for England almost immediately after the inquest concluded, effectively placing himself beyond the reach of any follow-up questions anyone might have thought to ask. Several individuals connected to the production he and Landis had been working on gave accounts to journalists in the weeks that followed, describing the state of her distress in her final days with a specificity that suggested genuine knowledge of what she had been enduring. Not one of those accounts was published. Rex Harrison's career continued without interruption. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1964 for his performance in My Fair Lady. He received a knighthood. He was celebrated as one of the great gentlemen of the English stage and screen. Carol Landis, who had been 29 years old and alive with talent and feeling, received a footnote in the histories of stars who burned briefly. She deserved considerably more than that, and the inquest that might have given it to her lasted barely long enough to be called an inquiry at all. Rex Harrison's studio protected him by asking no questions and ensuring that no one else did either. The next subject presented his studio with a different and more complicated challenge. How do you protect a genius when the evidence against him is not in a courtroom or a journalist's notebook, but sitting in a federal filing cabinet in Washington, D.C.? The file J. Edgar Hoover chose not to open. Charlie Chaplin created the language of cinema. That is not hyperbole. It is the considered judgment of every serious film historian who has examined what existed before him and what came after. The Little Tramp, the physical poetry of his movement, the way he could make an audience laugh and grieve simultaneously with a single gesture. His genius was real, enormous, and world-altering. It was also, as this chapter will carefully argue, precisely what made accountability so expensive for so many powerful people for so very long. The public story of Chaplin's expulsion from America in September of 1952 is well known in its broad outlines. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had long considered Chaplin a subversive presence, a man whose political sympathies leaned toward the left in ways that Hoover found professionally intolerable. When Chaplin sailed to England for the premiere of his film Limelight, Hoover moved to have his re-entry permit revoked. The stated justification was Chaplin's alleged communist sympathies. The press accepted this framing. The public accepted it. Chaplin settled in Switzerland, where he lived for the remaining 25 years of his life, framed forever as a political exile punished for his beliefs. What the declassified FBI files tell a researcher who examines them carefully is a more complicated story. Hoover's documentation on Chaplin was substantially more focused on his conduct toward very young women than on any political ideology. The files record, in the language of federal investigators, the details of his relationship with Mildred Harris, who was 16 years of age when that relationship began. They record the circumstances surrounding Lita Gray, who was 15 when Chaplin became involved with her on the set of The Gold Rush, who became pregnant at 16. Who married Chaplin in a ceremony arranged in Mexico specifically to avoid criminal prosecution under California law, and whose subsequent divorce filing ran to 50 pages of documented detail that the studio had ensured received the minimum possible serious press coverage. Hoover chose the political charge. He chose it because it was cleaner, because it required no young women to testify in any public proceeding, because it generated no uncomfortable examination of the industry's long history of managing Chaplin's conduct, and because it gave everyone involved, the studio, the press, the legal system, a narrative they could use without looking too carefully at what lay beneath it. Chaplin received the dignity of political martyrdom. The young women documented in Hoover's files received nothing that dignified their experiences in any way. The file that could have opened a different kind of accounting was closed, deliberately and permanently, in favor of a story that protected everyone it needed to protect. Hoover chose which part of Chaplin's file to act upon. The next story involves a man whose accountability was not managed by governments or studios. It was confirmed by the men themselves, on camera, in their own words, and it still changed nothing. The confession that changed nothing. In 1972, director Bernardo Bertolucci and Marlon Brando made a film in Paris that became one of the most discussed and debated works in the history of cinema. Last Tango in Paris was raw, transgressive, and deliberately shocking. It was also, as a confession made 35 years later would confirm, the site of something done to its young actress that she had described consistently from the moment the film was released as a genuine violation of her trust and her person. Maria Schneider was 19 years old when she appeared opposite Brando in that film, a young woman at the beginning of her career, possessing a natural luminosity that the camera found immediately and completely. She had never made a major film. She had no power, no standing, and no protection within an industry whose entire structure was designed to ensure that individuals in her position understood their relationship to individuals in his. What she had was talent, intelligence, and a resilience that would prove necessary in ways she could not have anticipated when she walked onto that Paris set. But there is a specific scene in Last Tango in Paris that became notorious upon the film's release, a scene involving an improvised element that was not in the script Schneider had agreed to perform. What audiences watching that scene did not know, and what Schneider said publicly from the 1970s onward, was that the improvised element had been planned between Bertolucci and Brando without her knowledge, specifically, as Bertolucci would eventually confirm in his own words, so that her reaction would be authentic rather than performed. In 2007, in an interview recorded on camera, Bernardo Bertolucci confirmed this account. He described the planning of the scene. He described the decision to withhold information from Schneider. He expressed something adjacent to regret, while also describing the scene's effect on the finished film with evident satisfaction. Brando's own autobiography had already described the moment in terms that corroborated Schneider's account of what she had not been told and had not consented to. Schneider had been saying the same thing for more than 30 years, before that confirmation arrived. After Bertolucci's confirmation, the film remained on best-of lists. Awards continued to be presented to its director. Brando's legacy was not seriously re-examined by any major institution of cinema culture. Schneider passed away in February of 2011. Bertolucci accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award 4 years after confirming on camera what he had done. Schneider was not mentioned in the presentation, and the men who had planned what was done to her without her knowledge lived long, celebrated, and extensively honored lives. The confirmation, when it finally came, changed almost nothing. And that silence after the confession is, in its own way, the most revealing fact of all. Brando and Bertolucci eventually confirmed what was done, and the industry absorbed the confirmation without consequence. The next story required something more elaborate: the coordinated intervention of a Hollywood studio and an agency of the United States government, working in remarkable alignment across 2 continents to ensure that what happened in Italy stayed precisely where it happened. The passing in Rome and the silence on both sides of the Atlantic. William Holden in 1955 was among the most bankable stars in Hollywood. His Academy Award for Stalag 17 was barely 2 years old. Paramount had significant productions built around him. He was handsome, charming, effortlessly convincing in roles that required him to project both toughness and vulnerability. And he was in Italy on what might be described as a working holiday, enjoying the European life that his level of success had made available to him. He loved fast cars. He loved the freedom that distance from Hollywood provided. And in the spring of that year, that freedom produced consequences that required the coordinated efforts of 2 powerful institutions to contain. Holden's vehicle was involved in a collision on a road outside Rome. A young Italian man, a student by accounts of the period, on with a family who would spend years waiting for acknowledgement that never came, lost his life as a result of that collision. Holden, who had been consuming alcohol, faced genuine legal exposure under Italian law. The Italian authorities pursued the matter through their legal system with the seriousness the circumstances warranted. What the Italian legal system could not have anticipated was the speed and efficiency with which Paramount's European legal representatives and American diplomatic contacts would mobilize to manage the situation. The result was a suspended sentence, significant in legal terms, but practically speaking an outcome that allowed Holden to return to his career without interruption. More significantly, the story received virtually no coverage in the American press, despite being documented in Italian court records and reported in Italian media with the prominence the circumstances deserved. The mechanism of American press suppression in this case was not the standard studio publicity apparatus. It operated through the access relationship between American foreign correspondents stationed in Europe and the diplomatic and studio sources whose cooperation those correspondents depended upon professionally. Reporting a story that embarrassed both a major Hollywood studio and American diplomatic interests in a foreign country was not merely professionally risky. It was, for a working journalist of that era, who needed those relationships to function, professionally suicidal. And the Italian family whose son had lost his life received neither public acknowledgement nor meaningful compensation through any process the public ever witnessed. William Holden returned to Paramount. He continued making films that audiences loved. The incident appears in his biographies, those few that mention it at all, in passages so carefully constructed that most readers pass through them without registering what they have read. It is, by any honest measure, one of the most completely successful acts of transatlantic suppression in Hollywood history, and almost no one has ever heard of it. If you have not yet subscribed to Golden Age Files, we want to ask you to do that right now. These stories have been buried for decades, and we are committed to bringing them into the light where they belong. Hit the subscribe button and stay with us, because what is coming next is something that requires no legal machinery, no diplomatic coordination, and no studio intervention of any kind. It required only an image, and the image did everything. The Patriots ledger Bob Hope gave 57 years of his life entertaining American troops in active combat zones. That record is genuine, and it is honorable, and nothing in this chapter asks you to see it otherwise. He performed in the South Pacific during the Second World War, in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, always at personal risk, always with the generosity of a man who understood that what he was offering mattered to people who needed it desperately. The soldiers who watched him perform loved him for it. America loved him for it, and that love was completely deserved. It is also, then, and this is the argument this chapter makes with full seriousness, the most effective suppression mechanism in Hollywood history, not because it was designed to be, but because it functioned as one with a precision that no studio lawyer could have matched. The editorial calculation was simple, consistent, and operated without coordination or instruction across every major American press outlet for decades. Bob Hope was the troops. The troops were Bob Hope. To publish a story that complicated his image was not merely to complicate one entertainer's reputation, it was to complicate the troops themselves. No editor of the 1950s or 1960s or 1970s was prepared to make that argument to their readership. And so the accounts that existed were not published. There was no meeting where this was decided, and no memo was circulated. The decision was made independently, repeatedly, and identically in newsrooms across the country for decades. Multiple women connected to Hope's productions and his personal circle gave accounts, to journalists who recorded them, to individuals who included them in memoirs and in interviews conducted carefully and late in life, when the professional consequences of speaking had diminished but not entirely disappeared. These accounts described a pattern of behavior, consistent in its details across independent sources, that ranged from persistent and unwanted personal pressure to specific documented incidents. The women who gave these accounts found themselves without a platform that was prepared to use what they offered. The image absorbed their words the way a stone wall absorbs sound, completely, silently, and without leaving any mark. Hope passed away in July of 2003 at the age of 100 years. The Congressional Gold Medal, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, honorary military ranks from all 5 branches of the American Armed Forces. The tributes named his talent and his decades of selfless service and his irreplaceable place in the American story. The women whose accounts existed in journalist notebooks and the pages of unpublished memoirs watched those tributes from a silence they had learned, across decades of trying, was institutional and absolute. The patriotic image did not merely outlive their accounts. In most cases, it outlived the women who had given them. Hope's protection required no machinery beyond the image itself. The next subject had a different kind of protection. 4 sons who told the truth in print, or on the record, at considerable personal cost, and who discovered that the truth, even when published in a best-selling memoir, can be absorbed by an industry that simply decides not to respond to it. What the memoir didn't stop: White Christmas, swinging on a star. The voice that became the sound of the American holiday, not just heard but felt, woven into the fabric of every Christmas morning, every family gathering, every winter ritual that the audience watching tonight has carried through their lives. Bing Crosby's connection to the American imagination is not merely cultural. For millions of people, it is personal. It belongs to them. This chapter does not ask them to give it back. It asks them to understand what was happening in the household behind that voice, and it asks them to remember a name: Lindsay Crosby. And in 1983, Gary Crosby published a memoir titled Going My Own Way. In it, he described his father with a specificity and consistency that made the book impossible to dismiss as the grievance of a single disgruntled child. The father, Gary, described administered physical punishment with the regularity and dispassion of a military commander. He withheld affection with the completeness of a man who considered emotional warmth a weakness he had chosen not to practice. He enforced discipline in his household with a severity that left marks, not visible ones, but the kind that determines the shape of a life. Gary's brothers Philip and Dennis corroborated specific incidents on the record. Their accounts matched Gary's with a precision that independent fabrication could not have produced. Journalists who covered the memoir's publication received additional accounts from individuals connected to the Crosby household, accounts that went further than what appeared in the book, in ways those individuals were not willing to put into print under their own names, but were willing to share with reporters they trusted. Those accounts were not published. The memoir had commercially exhausted the editorial appetite for the subject, and the estate had made the legal consequences of additional publication clear to anyone considering it. Lindsay Crosby chose to end his life in December of 1989. He was 51 years old. Those who knew him, who had watched him carry the weight of his childhood across the decades of his adult life, connected his passing directly to that weight. And the industry that had built Bing Crosby's image of warmth and paternal devotion received the news of Lindsay's passing and responded with the instrument it had always found most reliable: silence. The Christmas specials continued airing, the albums continued to sell, and 3 surviving sons lived with the knowledge that their testimony had been received, processed, and set carefully aside by an industry that had too much invested in a voice to examine what that voice had belonged to. The industry's silence after Bing Crosby's son spoke was a choice, made deliberately, based on a calculation. The next chapter belongs to a director whose work the audience has loved for their entire lives, and to a woman who told the same story about that work for 40 years before anyone with the power to respond decided she deserved to be heard. On what Tippi Hedrin told the world for 40 years. There is a scene in Vertigo, you know the one, where James Stewart watches a woman transform herself into someone else entirely at a man's insistence, and the camera circles them both as if the world itself has become unstable. It is one of the most unsettling images in the history of cinema, and Alfred Hitchcock constructed it with the precision of a man who understood in ways that went beyond filmmaking technique exactly what it looks like when a powerful man reshapes a woman according to his own requirements. His films are masterpieces by any measure. Rear Window, Psycho, The Birds. He redefined what cinema could do with fear, desire, and the human face. He is revered as perhaps the greatest director who ever lived. The audience has loved his work their entire lives, and that love is real. And it makes what Tippi Hedrin said for 40 years all the more important to finally hear clearly. Tippi Hedrin was a 29-year-old model when Alfred Hitchcock selected her for The Birds in 1962. She had never made a film. She had no power, no standing, and no protection within an industry whose entire structure was designed to ensure that individuals in her position understood their relationship to individuals in his. What she had was talent, intelligence, and a resilience that would prove necessary in ways she could not have anticipated when she walked onto his set. Hedrin's account of what followed has been given consistently since the 1970s, long before the cultural vocabulary existed to describe it clearly, long before giving such an account carried any professional advantage, and long before the industry had developed any mechanism for receiving it. She describes a campaign of psychological manipulation conducted by Hitchcock across the filming of The Birds and the subsequent production of Marnie. She describes the breaking of explicit assurances regarding the use of live birds on the set of The Birds, assurances she had been given and relied upon, replaced without warning by a week of live animals being used in ways that left her physically and emotionally harmed. She describes unwanted personal advances, explicit threats to her career when she declined them, and a years-long professional retaliation that made her effectively unemployable in major Hollywood productions for the remainder of the decade. She named specific incidents. She named specific dates. She named individuals who had witnessed what she described. And the industry, the same industry that had given Hitchcock its highest honors, that had built an entire aesthetic mythology around his films, that had decided his genius was a cultural inheritance too valuable to examine critically, received her testimony with a silence so complete it functioned as its own kind of verdict. She was quietly characterized as difficult, as bitter, as a woman who had failed to understand the honor of working with a master and had chosen resentment over gratitude. Her career never recovered its early trajectory. When Hitchcock received the American Film Institute's Lifetime Achievement Award in 1979, Hollywood's most powerful figures stood and applauded the man who, by his own leading lady's consistent and documented account, who had used his absolute authority over her professional life as a tool of personal control. Tippi Hedrin was not in the room. She has never stopped telling the truth about why. Hitchcock's power was the power of artistic genius and institutional reverence. The next subject's power was quieter and more intimate, but it produced a silence just as complete, carried by a woman whose grace in bearing it remains one of the most remarkable things this channel has ever had the occasion to document. The account Patricia Neal carried for 3 decades. We are past the halfway point of tonight's journey, and before we continue, we want to hear from you. Which of these revelations has stayed with you most deeply? Flynn's courtroom machinery, Tippi Hedrin's 40 years of testimony, or one of the others? And we want to know, which Golden Age Hollywood star or story would you like us to explore in a future video? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your responses genuinely shape what we make next. Now, let's continue. Gary Cooper was the embodiment of a certain American ideal, tall, quiet, unhurried, projecting a moral authority that required no argument and admitted no doubt. High noon, Mr. Deeds goes to town, Sergeant York. For millions of the women watching tonight, Cooper represented something close to the definition of what a good man looked like. And Patricia Neal, who was 23 years old when she fell completely in love with him on the set of The Fountainhead in 1949, was not wrong to love him. She was a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and talent, and when the love she felt was genuine and total. What she could not have fully understood at 23 was the precise weight of the system that stood behind the man she loved, and what that system would require her to carry when the situation between them became inconvenient. When Neal became pregnant with Cooper's child in 1950, the response was swift and decisive and arranged almost entirely without her as an equal participant in the decision. A medical procedure was required, prohibited under American law at the time, conducted in circumstances that were dangerous and, by any account of them, deeply traumatic. Cooper, whose Catholic faith made what was being arranged a source of genuine personal torment, was nonetheless the man whose image, whose marriage, and whose standing in the industry were the primary considerations the system around him was designed to protect. His wife, Veronica, who discovered the relationship, made the professional consequences of its continuation unmistakably clear to Neal. The studio's interest in the matter was not Patricia Neal's well-being. It was Gary Cooper's image, and the image required that the situation be resolved and that resolution remain permanently private. Neal left Hollywood temporarily afterward. She went to Broadway. She worked. She carried what she had been asked to carry with a grace that was, under the circumstances, extraordinary. She did not speak of it publicly, not in the 1950s, not in the 1960s, not for 38 years after it happened. The silence was not entirely chosen, and it was the silence that the system around Gary Cooper had determined was necessary, and it was enforced by the same mechanisms of professional consequence and social pressure that enforced every other silence on tonight's list. Cooper passed away from cancer in May of 1961. He had never spoken publicly about what Neal had been asked to endure. In her 1988 autobiography, Neal wrote about their relationship and its conclusion with a directness and a grief that had lost none of its intensity across 4 decades. She stated that she believed the complications from the prohibited procedure may have contributed to her difficulty carrying subsequent pregnancies to term. She described the experience as the saddest thing that had ever happened to her. She had loved him completely. She had carried the consequences of that love alone, in silence, for the entirety of a public career that eventually included an Academy Award and a recovery from a devastating medical crisis that made her one of the most admired women in America. She deserved to have her story told. She finally told it herself. Patricia Neal carried her story for 38 years before she could say it in public. The next subject's story was carried in silence by a different kind of witness entirely, not a woman who loved a star, but the institution of American cinema itself, which built the most righteously moral public image in Hollywood history for a man whose private conduct violated every principle he put on screen. The commandments he kept only on screen. In 1955, a journalist with connections to Paramount's production community believed she had enough. She had accounts. She had sources willing to speak in the background. She had an editor who had not yet told her no. She did not publish the story. And what changed her mind? The calculations she made, the specific pressure that arrived, the professional reality she weighed against the accounts she was holding, is, in its own way, the most instructive detail in Cecil B. DeMille's entire history. Because the story she chose not to publish was not unique. It was one of many. And the reason those many stories were not published was not that they lacked sources. It was that DeMille had built something more powerful than any individual account could overcome. Cecil B. DeMille made the 10 Commandments, not once, but twice. He made Samson and Delilah and The Greatest Show on Earth, and film after film in which the moral order of the universe was affirmed, divine law was upheld, and virtue was shown to be its own magnificent reward. Many in the audience watching tonight saw those films in theaters as young women, sat in darkened cinemas, and watched Moses receive divine law and felt the genuine power of what DeMille had put on screen. He gave interviews in which he spoke about God and decency and the responsibility of art to elevate the human spirit, and he gave them with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed he was doing the Lord's work from his director's chair. Audiences believed him, the industry believed him, and that belief was, as this chapter will demonstrate, the most perfectly constructed immunity from accountability that Hollywood's golden age ever produced. The culture surrounding access to DeMille's productions was documented by multiple actresses across multiple decades, women who worked on his films, who sought work on his films, and who encountered the reality of what that access required in ways that contradicted with a completeness that was almost architectural. Every public statement DeMille had ever made about morality and the dignity of women. The accounts describe a systematic environment in which personal compliance was understood as professional expectation, communicated through the mechanisms of proximity and consequence that powerful men in total institutional control have always had available to them. Actresses who declined what was expected found their careers at Paramount redirected without explanation. Actresses who spoke about their experiences found DeMille's considerable moral standing in the community waiting for them like a wall. Because who would believe such accounts of a man who had made the 10 Commandments, who had portrayed Moses receiving divine law from the hand of God? The implausibility was not incidental to the protection. It was the protection. The more righteously moral the public image, the more completely unthinkable the private reality, and the more effectively the accounts of those who had experienced that private reality were absorbed and dismissed. DeMille passed away in January of 1959, having never faced public examination of any kind regarding the culture of his productions. His reputation was so completely pristine that the Directors Guild of America named its Lifetime Achievement Award after him, the Cecil B. DeMille Award, presented annually at the Golden Globe ceremonies. To this day, in the name of a man whose documented private conduct and whose celebrated public morality existed in a relationship of almost perfect inversion, the women whose accounts sit in studio archives and in private correspondence have never received acknowledgement of any kind. Every year the award is given. Every year his name is spoken with reverence, and the commandments he chose not to keep remain exactly where he left them, unexamined, unexplained, and permanently attached to someone else's legacy. DeMille used moral authority as armor. The next subject used something different. The raw, yet unmediated power of institutional control, applied so completely and for so long that accountability was not merely absent. It was, by design, architecturally impossible. The man who built the machine. Every star on tonight's list had someone who made a phone call when the situation required it. Every suppression had an operator, a fixer, a legal representative who arrived before the police or the press and began the work of shaping what the record would contain. But those operators did not appear from nowhere. They were trained, funded, and given their authority by the men who ran the studios. And of all the men who ran the studios, there was one whose name appears, directly or indirectly, behind more of the machinery on tonight's list than any other. Louis B. Mayer ran Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer from 1924 to 1951. Think of the films that came from that studio during those years. Think of the stars whose faces you grew up loving. The voices, the smiles, the performances that shaped what you believed glamour and beauty and strength could look like. Mayer made all of it possible. He built the machine that produced the golden age the audience watching tonight has spent their lives treasuring. He also designed the system in which what this channel has been describing all evening was not merely possible, it was inevitable. Mayer's power at MGM was total in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey to a modern audience. The studio's stars, under the ironclad contracts that bound them to MGM for the duration of their professional lives, were not merely employees, they were assets, and their value was maintained with the same discipline and the same ruthlessness that any sufficiently valuable asset receives from the institution that owns it. Mayor's office was understood by those who worked at MGM as a space where the normal rules of professional and personal conduct did not apply, where the power differential between the man behind the desk and the individual on the other side of it was so complete that the very concept of refusal was practically theoretical. Those who worked in his office across the years described a specific and consistent pattern. The meeting would begin with tears. Mayor was famous for his ability to weep on command, and he used it as a tool of manipulation with the same calculation that other men used legal threats. The tears would give way to rage, and the rage would give way to the quiet statement of what would happen to a career that required him to have this conversation again. Multiple accounts from women who worked at MGM, documented in biographies drawn from studio records, personal correspondence, and the testimony of individuals who worked alongside them, describe behavior in those private meetings that was systematic in its predation and practiced in its mechanics. And because he was the reporting mechanism, because the machinery of accountability at MGM ran through his office and terminated there, no reporting mechanism existed for anyone whose experience of that office required one. Mayer passed away in October of 1957. The industry he had built mourned him as its founding patriarch. With the accounts that multiplied in the years following his passing, in memoirs, in biographies, in the carefully worded recollections of women who had waited until safety permitted honesty, received no institutional response. No studio issued an acknowledgement. No industry body examined the record. MGM's Roaring Lion continues to open films to this day. It is one of the most recognizable images in the history of entertainment, and it carries in its magnificent roar no acknowledgement of what roared behind it. Louis B. Mayer built the machine. The next chapter examines what happened when one of Hollywood's most celebrated stars encountered that machine. Not during her career, but after her passing, when the woman who might have deployed it on her own behalf was no longer present to direct it, and when the machine turned, with quiet efficiency, to the work of protecting her image from the truth about her. The stories that came after Mommy Dearest. When Christina Crawford published Mommy Dearest in 1978, the detonation it produced across Hollywood was immediate and total. Joan Crawford had passed away the previous year, in May of 1977, and could not respond to her daughter's account of a childhood defined by fear, by unpredictability, and by a maternal presence that oscillated between calculated warmth and something considerably darker. The book sold in enormous numbers. It was adapted into a film. It became a cultural reference point, a shorthand, a piece of the American vocabulary. And the world, having received it, made a decision it did not know it was making. It decided the story was finished. It was not. In the months and years following the memoir's publication, journalists who had covered Crawford's career and who had cultivated relationships with individuals who had worked in her household and on her productions began receiving accounts that went further than what Christina Crawford had put into print. Accounts from domestic staff and from individuals connected to specific productions whose descriptions of particular incidents were consistent with the memoir's portrait while adding details and dimensions that the published book did not contain. The accounts described an environment that the memoir had captured in outline, but not, those who gave them insisted, in its full dimensions. These individuals were willing to speak in the background to journalists they trusted. They were not willing to speak on the record. And what prevented them from doing so was not merely personal reluctance. Crawford's estate, administered following her passing, had responded to the memoir with legal aggression that sent a clear and lasting message to anyone considering additional publication. The costs of challenging the estate's management of Crawford's image were made unmistakably apparent. Journalists who had received these additional accounts weighed the professional and legal consequences of publishing them against the commercial reality that the memoir had already saturated public appetite for the subject. The accounts were not published. They were filed. They remain in journalist archives, and where researchers with the appropriate access and the appropriate patience can find them. Descriptions of a fuller and, in certain respects, more troubling picture than the one the world has accepted as complete. The camp classic that Mommy Dearest became in popular culture served, entirely unintentionally, as its own form of suppression. When a story is transformed into irony, into costume and quotation, it becomes harder to examine seriously. The truth was absorbed into entertainment, and the fuller truth was locked in filing cabinets by an estate that understood, with considerable legal sophistication, that the most effective cover-up is the one that follows a partial revelation and prevents anyone from looking further. The world believed the story was finished. The filing cabinets knew otherwise. Joan Crawford's estate locked the additional accounts away with legal pressure. The next subject's protection was constructed from something entirely different. A public image of such authentic, colorful danger that it functioned as the perfect concealment for a private record that required concealment of a very different kind. The file beyond the headline. Robert Mitchum was Hollywood's most authentically dangerous leading man, heavy-lidded, magnificently indifferent to the opinions of the studio system, radiating a physical menace that his peers worked hard to project in their performances and that Mitchum simply existed in as a natural condition of being himself, out of the past. The Night of the Hunter, Cape Fear. Those films did not create his danger. They confirmed it, gave it a screen on which to operate, made the quality that audiences sensed in him available for 2 hours at a time in the darkness of a theater. His apprehension for possession of a controlled substance in September of 1948 made international headlines and seemed, to every observer of the Hollywood scene, like the beginning of the end of a career that had barely begun to fulfill its promise. Instead, it made him more famous than anything he had previously done on screen. Here is how the protection worked, and this is worth understanding carefully because it is different from every other mechanism on tonight's list. When a report arrived at RKO's publicity office regarding an incident involving Mitchum, those who handled it made a calculation that required no discussion and produced no paperwork. The man was already Mitchum. He was already notorious. He already existed in the public imagination in a category marked dangerous. What else did anyone need to know? The known danger made the unknown danger unsearchable because no one thinks to look for something specific in a place that is already, officially and publicly, marked as dark. Studio records and accounts from individuals who worked within RKO's publicity operation during the late 1940s and early 1950s document a pattern of incident management involving Mitchum that went significantly beyond the controlled substance apprehension that the public knew about and had decided to find charming. Multiple accounts from women connected to productions during this period, documented by biographers with access to studio correspondence. They describe incidents whose management consumed considerable studio resources and whose details were absorbed into the existing narrative of Mitchum's general volatility. When everything about a man reads as dangerous, specific accounts of specific conduct become invisible. They disappear into the atmosphere he creates. Mitchum's career flourished across 5 decades. His image as the authentic American original, too real and too indifferent for the manufactured glamour of the studio system, only deepened with time. The accounts that his studio managed most carefully during his years at RKO were never examined publicly, and because the examination required making a distinction that no journalist of the era was prepared to make. The distinction between the danger the public had accepted as part of his appeal and the conduct the studio had quietly buried beneath it. The file beyond the headline remained exactly where RKO had placed it, in the category of things that were known about and not discussed. And the danger that everyone could see made the danger that no one was supposed to find perfectly, permanently invisible. Robert Mitchum's known danger made his private record invisible by providing perfect atmospheric cover. The next subject had no such dramatic public persona to hide behind. What he had was something quieter, more intoxicating, and in the end, more permanently protective. The most celebrated voice of the American century, and a journalist machinery that had decided, collectively and without instruction, that certain things about the chairman of the board were simply not for public consumption. What the notebooks contain. We are nearly at the end of tonight's journey. Before we reach our final chapter, if what you have heard tonight has meant something, if these stories, finally surfaced after decades of silence, feel like something worth sharing, please take a moment to like this video and pass it along to someone in your life who loves classic Hollywood. These stories belong to all of us. The people whose accounts were suppressed deserve to be heard. Sharing this video is one way of insisting that they finally are. Now, one final chapter, and it may be the most important one we have told. Frank Sinatra's music belongs to you. Nothing in this chapter touches that. What it asks you to consider is the specific and documented space between the chairman's public record and the notebooks of the journalists who covered him, because that space was not accidental. It was maintained deliberately and at considerable effort by a machinery that is worth understanding clearly. Multiple journalists who covered Sinatra's professional and personal circle during the 1950s and 1960s documented specific incidents in their working notebooks that were not published. The reasons were several and interlocking. Access agreements with Sinatra's organization were explicit in their conditions. Journalists who reported on what they witnessed in certain contexts would not witness anything again. Sinatra's well-documented connections to individuals who could make professional consequences, both permanent and unpleasant, were not theoretical deterrents. They were understood by every working journalist in his orbit as operational realities. And the editorial culture of the era treated the private conduct of men at Sinatra's level of commercial and cultural importance as categorically outside the boundaries of legitimate journalism. The notebooks exist. Researchers who have examined the personal papers of journalists who covered Sinatra's circle in the 1950s have found documented accounts of specific evenings, specific incidents at the Sands Hotel during the peak Rat Pack years, specific accounts given by women present at gatherings that journalists attended under access agreements that made publication professionally terminal. Those accounts are in the papers. They are legible. They are detailed. And they have never been published in any mainstream forum because the access agreements that allowed the journalists into those rooms specified, with the kind of clarity that required no lawyers to interpret, exactly what the price of admission was. Women who encountered specific incidents in Sinatra's circle and who attempted to give accounts of those incidents found themselves without a platform, without an editorial structure prepared to receive what they were offering, and without any realistic prospect of being heard in a way that produced consequences of any kind. The accounts were given, and they were recorded by journalists who could not publish them, and they remained, for the duration of Sinatra's life and for decades afterward, in precisely the category of suppressed knowledge that this channel exists to examine. Sinatra passed away in May of 1998. The tributes were global, and they were sincere. The voice, the artistry, the ring-a-ding cool that had defined a specific and irreplaceable version of the American 20th century. The journalist notebooks went into archives, some donated to universities, some remaining in private hands. The women whose accounts were recorded in those pages are, for the most part, no longer living. The chairman received his final standing ovation. The record remained exactly as his people had always intended it to remain, incomplete and permanent. The notebooks sit in their archives, and the music plays on, as beautiful as it ever was, in a world that chose to leave them closed. The king's crown and the man who held it in place. And so we arrive at the final name on tonight's list. The name that may matter most, not because the story connected to it is the most dramatic, but because it contains within it the explanation for every story that came before it. Clark Gable was called the King of Hollywood, and that title was not merely promotional language. It described something real, a presence so complete, a charm so total, a physical authority so immediate that audiences experienced him not as a performer, but as a fact. Rhett Butler, the smile that could stop a room without effort, the quiet certainty that suggested a man who had never in his life needed to wonder whether he was enough. For the women watching tonight, Clark Gable may be the name on this list that costs the most to hear. That cost is understood, and it is honored, and it is, in its way, exactly the point. Howard Strickling served as MGM's chief of publicity from the 1920s until the studio system's decline in the early 1960s. He was, by any honest assessment, the most effective suppression operator in the history of the entertainment industry. Not because he was the most ruthless or the most powerful, but because he was the most systematic. His methods were not improvised responses to individual crises. They were a refined, tested, constantly improved set of procedures for ensuring that the gap between what MGM stars did privately and what the public understood them to be remained precisely as wide as MGM required it to be. Press management, witness relocation, cooperation with the Los Angeles Police Department and with local officials whose departments had developed over many years, a productive working relationship with the studio, financial settlements conducted without paper trails. He was not a fixer. He was an institution, and Clark Gable was his finest work. The files Strickling maintained on Clark Gable, referenced by biographers who gained access to MGM personnel who worked alongside both men, documented incidents across Gable's career that required Strickling's personal and direct intervention. On the production of Mogambo in Kenya in 1953, during which a young woman connected to the production gave an account whose management was initiated before any formal record could be created, was one such incident. It was not, by the accounts of those who understood how Strickling's operation worked, an exceptional case. It was the system operating as designed. The King's image was not incidental to Strickling's work. It was the purpose of it. Every call he made, every record he shaped, every account he absorbed was made in service of that image. The image of a man so complete, so trustworthy, so simply and entirely the thing he appeared to be, that no question about him could gain purchase. Gable passed away in November of 1960, mourned by the world as the last embodiment of a masculine ideal that the changing culture was already in the process of making obsolete. Howard Strickling outlived him by 22 years, retiring to a private life that offered no public accounting of what his files had contained and what his methods had managed. When those files were examined by biographers in the years following his own passing, they confirmed what the insiders who had worked at MGM had always understood. The King's image had not been maintained by the King's conduct. It had been maintained by Strickling's work. The crown had never slipped, not because the man beneath it never gave it reason to slip, but because a very skilled, very discreet, and very well-compensated man had held it in place every single day of Clark Gable's career. That is the story of the machine. Not one man, not one studio, not one era's particular moral failures, but a system built deliberately, funded generously, and operated with a professionalism that the people whose accounts it suppressed were never meant to witness. And now you have witnessed it. There are people in tonight's stories who deserved better than the silence they were given. Patricia Neal, who carried 38 years of grief with a grace she should never have been required to possess. Maria Schneider, who told the truth for 30 years before anyone with the power to confirm it finally did. Carol Landis, who was 29 years old and deserved an inquest that lasted more than an hour. And Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley, whose names became a punchline in a language that had no word yet for what had been done to them. The machine is gone now, but the names it tried to erase are still here, and so are you, which means the silence it built did not hold completely. After all, if tonight has meant something to you, subscribe to Golden Age Files and join us for every story that follows. Leave a comment telling us which of these women stayed with you and which corner of Hollywood's hidden history you would like us to explore next. We read everything you write, and we are grateful for every one of you who stayed until the curtain came down. Until next time, from Golden Age Files, thank you for watching.